Good evening, all, and welcome back to Dark Fears. Tonight, we journey into the forgotten heart of Pennsylvania, where small towns cradle secrets darker than their coal mines, and where 10 real people discovered that the greatest horrors do not announce themselves with fanfare, but instead whisper through empty streets, hide behind friendly faces, and wait in basements no one dares to enter. These are not legends passed down through generations. These are documented accounts of ordinary individuals who stumbled into nightmare scenarios they never saw coming. Events that law enforcement still discusses in hushed tones, and mysteries that continue to haunt the communities where they occurred. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Dark Fears for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now, let us step into the shadows of the Appalachian deep woods, where civilization ends and terror begins. James had always dreamed of escaping the noise and chaos of Philadelphia. So when he found a small rental house in Minersville, Schuylkill County, it felt like fate had finally cut him a break. The town was tucked between forested hills, holding barely 3,000 souls, and the rent was half of what he paid for his cramped city apartment. The landlord, Carl Dietrich, a man with weathered hands and a thick Pennsylvania Dutch accent, handed him the keys on a crisp October morning. He told James that the neighbors were good people who looked out for each other. James believed him. After 32 years of urban anonymity, the promise of community felt like a gift. The house itself was modest but charming. A 2-bedroom Cape Cod with white aluminum siding and black shutters that could have used a fresh coat of paint. It sat on Elm Street, a quiet residential block where children rode bicycles and elderly couples walked their dogs in the cool evenings. James spent his first week unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, and settling into the slow rhythm of small-town life. Working remotely as a software developer meant most of his days were spent in front of a glowing screen, while the town drifted around him at its own unhurried pace. He found comfort in the routine, in the way the mail carrier waved every afternoon at 2:15, in the distant echo of the high school marching band practicing on Wednesday nights. His neighbor to the east, Mrs. Helen Kowalski, introduced herself on his third day in town. She was 74, she said proudly, with silver hair pinned into a tidy bun and floral house dresses that seemed pulled straight from another era. She showed up at his front door carrying a homemade apple pie still warm from the oven, its golden crust perfectly crimped along the edges. James invited her inside for coffee, grateful for the kindness, and they sat at his small kitchen table while she asked about his life, his work, and what had brought him to Minersville. He found himself opening up more than he usually did with strangers, talking about the divorce that had left him emotionally and financially drained, about his desire for quiet, for simplicity, for a life that didn't feel like it was grinding him down. Mrs. Kowalski listened with genuine compassion, patting his hand now and then and assuring him he had made the right choice. When she finally left an hour later, James felt certain he had landed exactly where he needed to be. The relationship that grew over the following weeks felt easy and natural. Mrs. Kowalski would bring him dinner 2 or 3 times a week, explaining that she cooked too much for one person and couldn't stand to see good food go to waste. James would help her carry groceries or take out her trash, small favors that felt like a fair exchange for her generosity. She told him stories about Minersville, the coal mining history that had shaped the town, the families who had lived there for generations, and her late husband Walter, who had spent 40 years underground before black lung claimed him in 1998. James listened and nodded, genuinely interested in the oral history she offered so openly. It was mid-November when James first noticed the unusual traffic at Mrs. Kowalski's house. He worked in the converted second bedroom that faced her property, his desk positioned beside the window where the afternoon light was best. That's when he began noticing the pattern. Visitors arriving at odd hours, usually after dark, always parking inside her detached garage rather than on the street. They never stayed long, maybe 15 or 20 minutes, and they always left carrying large canvas bags or boxes. James tried to shrug it off. He told himself it wasn't his business, that maybe she ran a small home operation or hosted some kind of card group for seniors. But those rationalizations grew harder to swallow as November rolled into December and the traffic increased. He began noting the license plates in a spreadsheet, not because he suspected anything criminal, he told himself, but because he was the kind of person who noticed patterns and felt compelled to make sense of them. The vehicles came from all over eastern Pennsylvania. Reading, Allentown, Harrisburg, even a few from across the border in New Jersey. And none of the visitors looked like elderly card players. They were younger, mostly men, with the hardened faces of people who had lived rough and complicated lives. The first real warning sign came on a Tuesday evening in mid-December. James had just returned from the grocery store when he saw Mrs. Kowalski in her driveway, speaking with a man who towered over her small frame. Even from 30 feet away, James could feel the tension in the air, sharp, tight, and hear the clipped urgency in their low voices. As he climbed out of his car with his bags, the man turned toward him, and James found himself staring into eyes completely devoid of warmth. Mrs. Kowalski stepped between them almost immediately, her cheerful demeanor snapping back into place like a mask. She called out a friendly greeting to James, then guided the man toward her garage with practiced ease. The man glanced back one more time before disappearing inside, and a cold sensation settled in James's stomach. That night, James couldn't sleep. He lay in bed listening to the wind rattle his windows, replaying the man's expression over and over. The canvas bags, the late-night visitors, the growing frequency of their comings and goings. At 3 a.m, he finally admitted what he had been avoiding for weeks. Something illegal was happening next door. The question was what, and more importantly, what he was supposed to do about it. Mrs. Kowalski had been nothing but kind. She had shown him warmth when he was lonely and starting over. The idea of betraying that kindness felt wrong, but ignoring criminal activity felt just as wrong. He decided he needed more information before he made any decisions. Over the next week, James began taking walks at different times of day and night, always carrying his phone with a camera ready. He photographed license plates, recorded arrival and departure times, and tried to uncover patterns in the operation. What he discovered was a level of organization that surprised him. The visitors came in shifts, never overlapping, always punctual. Mrs. Kowalski ran her operation with the precision of someone who had been doing it for years. And on December 22nd, James finally saw something undeniable. One visitor had parked carelessly, leaving his car half blocking the sidewalk. When he emerged from the garage carrying his usual canvas bag, the fabric shifted just enough to expose what was inside. From 50 feet away, pretending to check his mailbox, James saw the unmistakable glint of clear plastic packages filled with white powder. His hand trembled as he walked back to his house. Mrs. Kowalski wasn't running a friendly card night. She was dealing drugs, and judging by the number of visitors, she had been doing it for a very long time. James spent Christmas Eve locked in a battle with his conscience. He sat alone in his quiet house, the apple pie long gone, trying to reconcile the kind, grandmotherly woman who had welcomed him with a criminal empire operating 30 feet from his bedroom. He thought about calling the police anonymously. He thought about packing up and disappearing. He even imagined confronting her directly. Every option carried risks he was terrified to face. The decision came for him on December 26th. At 9 that evening, a knock sounded at his door. When he opened it, Mrs. Kowalski stood on the porch, but the warm, gentle figure he knew was gone. In her place was someone colder, sharper, someone whose eyes held the same dead emptiness he had seen in that towering visitor weeks earlier. She didn't wait for an invitation. She brushed past him into the living room and quietly closed the door behind her. Then she told him, calmly, almost conversationally, that she had noticed his sudden curiosity. She told him she had friends who made problems disappear. She told him Minersville was her town and had been for 40 years, and that outsiders who asked too many questions didn't tend to stay long. She spoke in the same soft tone she'd used when offering him pie, which somehow made every word even more chilling. James stood rooted to the floor as she continued, explaining that she knew about his divorce, his debts, his lack of nearby family. She knew everything, because she made it her business to know everything about anyone living in her territory. Then her voice changed. She told him she liked him, that he seemed smart, precise, someone who understood how the world really operated. She offered him a job, help her keep inventory and schedules with the same meticulous attention he had shown while watching her. The pay would be generous, far more than his software job. Or he could pack up and leave Minersville within 48 hours. He was never to mention what he'd seen. Those were his only options. There was no third path that ended safely. James told her he needed time. Mrs. Kowalski smiled, patted his cheek the way she had when they first met, and told him he had until noon the next day to decide. Then she left, closing the door gently behind her. James spent the night packing. By dawn, he had loaded every essential thing into his car. But before he drove away, he did something that terrified him more than anything else he had ever done. He drove to the state police barracks in Pottsville, 15 miles away, and told them everything. He showed them his photographs, his spreadsheets, the months of documented activity. He told them about Mrs. Kowalski's threats and her offer. The troopers listened with the weary expressions of people who had stopped being surprised years ago. They told him to leave Pennsylvania immediately, to get far away, to stay with friends or family while they prepared their case. They explained that Mrs. Kowalski had been suspected for years, but had always stayed a step ahead, protected by community loyalty, silence, and well-placed payoffs. His evidence, combined with their ongoing investigation, might finally be enough. James drove west that morning, his car packed with everything he owned for the second time in 6 months. He didn't stop until he reached his brother's house in Ohio, 400 miles from Minersville. He stayed there for 3 weeks, jumping at every unexpected noise, checking the news constantly for updates. The raid happened on January 15th. At dawn, state and federal agents descended on Elm Street, executing search warrants on Mrs. Kowalski's house and garage. They found over 30 kilograms of cocaine, along with methamphetamine, heroin, and detailed records of a distribution network that stretched across 4 states. Mrs. Kowalski was arrested, along with 6 associates. Local news reported that she had been operating since the early 1980s, taking over the business after her husband's death and expanding it far beyond anything he had built. James never returned to Minersville. His landlord let him break the lease, given the circumstances, and friends packed his remaining belongings and shipped them to Ohio. He eventually moved to Pittsburgh, where he found a new apartment and tried to rebuild his life. But the experience had changed him in ways he was still struggling to understand. He no longer trusted kindness at face value. He no longer believed small towns were innocent. And sometimes, late at night, He would think about apple pie and wonder if any gesture of warmth could ever again feel sincere rather than strategic. The price of doing the right thing, he learned, was losing the version of himself that existed before Mrs. Kowalski knocked on his door that December evening. Some forms of innocence, once shattered, are gone forever. Ella Whitmore disappeared on October 14, 1987, from her family's farm outside Bird in Hand, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. She was 17 years old, a junior at Pia Valley High School, and by all accounts a responsible young woman who helped her parents manage their 200 acres of corn and dairy cattle. The last confirmed sighting of Ella was at approximately 7:30 that Wednesday evening, when her younger brother, Samuel, saw her walking toward the southern cornfield carrying a flashlight. She never returned to the house, and by the time her parents realized she was missing 3 hours later, the autumn darkness had swallowed every trace of where she had gone. The Whitmore family had lived on that land for 4 generations. Ella's great-grandfather had bought the property in 1923, and each generation since had expanded it until it became one of the more productive farms in the region. The family was well respected, regular at Calvary Presbyterian Church, known for their fairness in business, and always the first to lend a hand when a neighbor struggled through a tough harvest. Ella herself was described by friends and teachers as quiet but friendly, studious without being isolated, the kind of young woman who volunteered at the local library and sang in the church choir every Sunday morning. The evening she disappeared had been unremarkable in every way. The family finished dinner at 6:45, as they did every weeknight. Margaret Whitmore had prepared pot roast with potatoes and carrots, and they sat together at the kitchen table discussing the ordinary details of their lives. Samuel's upcoming science fair project, the repairs needed on the barn roof, and the forecast warning of frost by the week's end. After dinner, Ella washed the dishes while her mother dried them and put them back in their cabinets, a routine they had performed together countless times. Her father, Robert, had gone out to the barn to check on a pregnant cow that was close to delivering. Samuel had retreated to his room to work on homework. Around 7:20, Ella had told her mother she was going to walk down to the southern cornfield to check whether the irrigation equipment had been turned off properly. Her father had worked in that field earlier in the day and mentioned at dinner that he thought he might have left one of the valves open. Ella offered to check so he wouldn't have to make the walk after his long day. Margaret had thought nothing of the request. The southern field was only a quarter mile from the house, easily visible from the kitchen window during daylight hours, and Ella had walked those fields alone hundreds of times throughout her childhood. Samuel, whose bedroom window faced south toward the cornfields, had been the last person to see his sister. He told investigators that at approximately 7:30, he looked up from his textbook and saw Ella's flashlight beam moving along the dirt path that led to the southern field. He watched for perhaps 30 seconds before returning to his homework. Everything had appeared routine. The flashlight moved steadily, not hurriedly or erratically. By 9 o'clock, Ella had still not returned, and Margaret began to worry. Robert had come in from the barn at 8:30, assuming Ella was in her room studying. When Margaret went upstairs to check and found Ella's room empty, the bed still neatly made from that morning. They both went to Samuel's room to ask if he knew where she was. Samuel told them about seeing her walk toward the southern field, and Robert immediately grabbed his flashlight and headed out. He found the irrigation valve properly closed, but there was no sign of his daughter. He walked the entire perimeter of the cornfield, calling her name into the darkness, hearing nothing but the wind moving through the dried stalks. He checked the equipment shed, the small building where they kept tools and fertilizer, and even the ancient well house that had not been used since the 1950s. Nothing. By 10 o'clock, Robert had called the Pennsylvania State Police. By 10:30, troopers arrived and began a preliminary search. By midnight, over 50 community volunteers had gathered with flashlights, walking systematic grid patterns across the Whitmore property. Their search continued into the next day, expanding to neighboring farms, the wooded areas bordering the property to the east, and the small creek that ran through the valley half a mile away. On the second day, a trooper found Ella's shoes at the edge of the southern cornfield, positioned neatly side by side on the dirt path about 30 feet from where it entered the standing corn. They were her everyday sneakers, white canvas with blue laces, and showed no signs of struggle or disturbance. They had simply been removed and placed carefully on the ground, as if Ella had stopped walking, taken them off, and continued barefoot into the field. The discovery of the shoes shifted the investigation entirely. Search dogs were brought in, using Ella's scent from clothing in her room. The dogs tracked to where the shoes had been found and then lost the trail completely. It was as if Ella had simply vanished into thin air at that exact spot. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging scoured the area. The cornfield was harvested early, so investigators could search every inch of ground. Ponds on neighboring properties were dragged. The creek was combed over and over by teams of volunteers. Nothing else belonging to Ella was ever found. The investigation consumed Lancaster County for months. Theories multiplied wildly. Some believed Ella had run away, perhaps pregnant or involved in a relationship her parents didn't know about. But friends insisted she had not been dating anyone. A search of her room revealed no hidden diary, no secret letters, no plane or bus tickets. Her savings account at the local bank contained $412, untouched. Others suggested she might have suffered a mental break and wandered off in confusion. But Ella had no history of psychological issues, no recent trauma, and no behavior suggesting instability. More sinister theories emerged as the investigation dragged on. Some speculated a stranger had been hiding in the cornfield and abducted her, but the neatly placed shoes suggested otherwise. Victims of sudden abduction do not stop to remove their footwear and set them down carefully. Others whispered about Ella's father, about possible abuse that might have driven her to flee, or worse. Investigators examined Robert Whitmore's life thoroughly and found nothing suspicious. He had no criminal record, no reports of domestic violence, no financial desperation. Friends and family insisted he was a devoted father, shattered by his daughter's disappearance. As 1987 turned to 1988, the active search was scaled back. The case remained open, the files swelling with witness statements, search reports, and theories that led nowhere. The Whitmore family held on to hope, kept Ella's room exactly as she had left it, and appeared on local news programs pleading for information. Margaret's hair turned white within a year. Robert stopped attending church, unable to reconcile his faith with the loss of his daughter. Samuel, only 14 at the time, grew up haunted by the memory of that flashlight beam moving away from the house. Years passed without resolution. In 1992, a hiker found human remains in the woods, 15 miles from the Whitmore farm. For one terrible week, the family thought they might finally have answers. DNA testing proved the remains belonged to someone else entirely. In 1999, a woman in Ohio claimed to be Ella, but was exposed as a fraud within days. In 2003, a deathbed confession by a convicted serial killer included claims about a victim matching Ella's description, but investigators determined it was false. Another attempt at posthumous notoriety. The truth, if it existed, remained as elusive as Ella herself had been that October evening. Some in the community believed the answer lay in the old stories about the land itself, about the Lenape who had lived there before European settlement, about the hollow in the woods where strange lights had been reported for over a century. These stories were dismissed by investigators as superstition, but they persisted in whispered conversations among those who had lived in Lancaster County for generations. In 2012, on the 25th anniversary of Ella's disappearance, a journalist from Philadelphia wrote a detailed feature about the case. The article included interviews with Ella's former classmates, now in their 40s, who spoke about the shadow her disappearance had cast over their entire high school experience. Samuel Whitmore, then 39 and working as an engineer in Pittsburgh, said he still sometimes dreamed about that flashlight beam and wondered what might have happened if he had called out to his sister or gone with her to the field. Margaret Whitmore had died in 2008. Her last words reportedly a plea for someone to find her daughter and bring her home. Robert lived until 2015, spending his final years sitting on the farmhouse porch, staring at the southern field where his daughter had last been seen. He never sold the property, never moved away, and never stopped waiting for an answer that never came. The farm was sold at auction in 2016. The new owners tore down the old farmhouse and built a modern home on the same foundation. They planted soybeans instead of corn. They knew nothing about Ella Whitmore except what they read in the disclosure documents, a paragraph about an unsolved disappearance nearly 30 years earlier. But the shoes remained part of the evidence file at the Pennsylvania State Police Barracks, sealed in a plastic bag with a case number written in faded ink. The question remained unanswered. Why had Ella removed her shoes that night? Where had she gone after stepping out of them? And was the answer something that could be explained by logic or something else entirely? Something that existed in the space between what we know and what we can never understand. The Ella Whitmore case remains open. Anyone with information is asked to contact the Pennsylvania State Police. Ryan Chen had spent 6 months searching for the perfect place to escape the suffocating pressure of his life in Manhattan. At 34, he had burned out completely from his career in financial consulting, and the panic attacks that had begun during his final year at the firm convinced him a drastic change was necessary. When he found the listing for a 3-bedroom house in Tobyhanna, Pennsylvania, deep in the Pocono Mountains, he thought he had discovered exactly what he needed. The price was impossibly low, $47,000, for a property that should have been worth at least 3 times that amount. The listing agent, a woman named Patricia Moss, who spoke with a thick local accent, explained that the house had been in foreclosure and the bank was eager to move it quickly. Ryan, with enough savings to buy the property outright, made an offer the same day he saw the photographs. The house sat at the end of a gravel road that wound through dense hemlock and pine forest. The nearest neighbor was half a mile away, and the small town center of Tobyhanna was a 15-minute drive down the mountain. The property itself was larger than Ryan had expected, sprawling across nearly 3 acres of wooded land with a small creek running along the eastern boundary. Built in 1974, the house was a split level with dark wood paneling and orange shag carpet that screamed of its era. But the bones were solid. The roof was relatively new, and Ryan convinced himself he could update it gradually while working remotely on the freelance projects he had lined up. He moved in during the first week of November, driving his rented moving truck up the steep driveway with a sense of accomplishment he had not felt in years. The isolation was exactly what he wanted. No sirens, no crowds, no expectations beyond what he set for himself. That first night, he slept more soundly than he had in months, lulled by the absolute silence of the mountain. The first incident occurred on his 4th night in the house. Ryan had been working late in the spare bedroom he had converted into an office, finishing a financial analysis for a client in Chicago. At approximately 2:15 a.m., he heard footsteps directly above him on the main floor. Distinct, heavy footsteps moving from the kitchen toward the living room. Ryan froze at his desk, listening as the sounds continued for perhaps 30 seconds before stopping abruptly. His first instinct was that someone had broken in. He grabbed his phone and quietly climbed the stairs from the lower level where his office was located. The main floor was empty. Every door and window remained locked exactly as he had left them. Ryan searched every room, checked every closet, and even went outside with a flashlight to inspect the exterior for any sign of forced entry. There was nothing. He convinced himself he had heard the house settling, old timbers adjusting to temperature changes, the kind of noises every aging structure made, but which felt amplified in the stillness of the mountains. But the footsteps returned the next night at almost the exact same time. And the night after that, always between 2 and 2:30 a.m., always following the same path from the kitchen to the living room. Ryan began staying awake just to listen for them. And soon, he started noticing other details that unsettled him. The footsteps had a rhythm to them, a deliberate, measured cadence that didn't resemble random settling noises. And they always stopped in the exact same place, directly in front of the stone fireplace that dominated the living room's east wall. On the 8th night, Ryan set up his laptop to record audio while he slept. The next morning, he listened to the file and heard the footsteps clearly captured, along with something else that made his skin crawl. After the footsteps stopped, there was a faint scraping sound, like something being dragged slowly across the floor, followed by what might have been a voice. The audio quality was too poor to distinguish any words, but the cadence was unmistakably human speech. Ryan spent that morning digging into the house's history. County records showed that the property had changed hands 4 times since 1974. The original owners, a couple named Douglas and Patricia Hriss, had lived there for 12 years before selling in 1986. The next owners, the Kowalski family, had stayed only 18 months before moving on. The third owners, listed as Vincent and Sarah Torres, had owned the property for 6 years, but according to deed records, had not lived there for the final 3, instead renting it out before finally selling in 2004. The most recent owner before foreclosure was David Brennan, a single man who had purchased the house in 2004 and defaulted on his mortgage in 2023. Ryan tried to track down contact information for any of the previous owners, but came up empty. The Hriss would now be in their 70s or 80s, if still alive, and the others had left no digital footprint to follow. He considered reaching out to Patricia Moss to ask about the house's history, but worried that mentioning the strange occurrences would make him appear foolish, or worse, mentally unstable. The phenomena escalated on November 19th. Ryan returned from a supply run to find every cabinet door in the kitchen standing open. He was certain he had closed them before leaving. 2 days later, on November 21st, he woke to discover that someone had rearranged the books on his living room shelf, organizing them by color rather than in the author order he had meticulously set. On November 24th, Ryan discovered that the furniture in his bedroom had been shifted several inches from its original positions, creating a clear path from the door to the window. Sleep became impossible. He lay awake for hours, listening intently for sounds, documenting every anomaly in a notebook, and desperately searching for rational explanations. He checked for carbon monoxide. Nothing. He investigated the possibility of animals in the walls or attic. Still nothing. He even wondered if he might be experiencing a psychological break, that the stress of his old life had broken something fundamental in his mind. But the audio recordings did not lie, Wagenknecht. The footsteps were real, captured by technology that could not fabricate them. On December 1st, Ryan decided to examine the area where the footsteps always stopped. The fireplace was enormous, built from riverstone and rising 16 feet to the cathedral ceiling. The hearth extended 4 feet into the room, forming a broad platform of slate tile. Ryan got down on his hands and knees, examining every inch of the hearth. He ran his fingers along the grout lines, pressed on each stone to see if any were loose. In the far right corner, where the hearth met the wall, he found something that did not belong. It was a small symbol carved into the grout between 2 slate tiles, barely visible unless one was looking for it. The design resembled a circle with 3 lines radiating from the center. Primitive, deliberate, and unmistakably intentional. Ryan photographed the symbol and searched online for matches, eventually finding similar designs on websites dedicated to folk magic and protective sigils. The symbol, according to multiple sources, was intended to trap malevolent spirits within a defined space. Ryan's rational mind fought the implication. He did not believe in ghosts, spirits, or anything supernatural. But he could not explain what was happening in his house through any conventional means. That night, he called his sister Monica, who lived in Boston. She listened patiently as he recounted the events, but eventually suggested that stress and paranoia might be affecting him, and that he should see a doctor. Ryan hung up, feeling more isolated than ever. On December 4th, the entity, or whatever it was, manifested visibly. Ryan had been in the kitchen at 9:30 p.m. when the temperature dropped sharply, his breath suddenly visible in the cold air. He turned to find a shadow standing before the fireplace, roughly human in shape, but without any defined features. It remained motionless for perhaps 10 seconds before dissipating like smoke. Ryan stood frozen, his heart hammering in his chest, unable to process what he had just witnessed. That night, he packed a bag and checked into a motel in Strasbourg, 15 miles from the house. Yet, in the sterile comfort of the room, fear gave way to anger. He had paid $47,000 for the house, invested weeks making it livable, and he refused to be driven away by something he could not understand. The next morning, he returned determined to find answers. Ryan began researching David Brennan, the previous owner who had let the house go into foreclosure. After hours of digging, he found an obituary. David Brennan had died in March 2023 at the age of 49 in a single vehicle accident on Route 423 near Tobyhanna. The obituary was brief, listing no surviving family and providing no details about his life. Ryan wondered if Brennan's death and the foreclosure were somehow connected to the house's disturbances. He continued searching and eventually discovered a newspaper article from February 2023, 2 months before Brennan's death. It described a police call to the address Ryan now owned. Officers had responded to reports of shouting and furniture being broken. When they arrived, Brennan was alone, highly agitated, claiming someone was trying to harm him. He had been evaluated at a local hospital and released. The article ended there, with no follow-up. Ryan sat in his office, staring at the article, feeling connections form that he did not want to acknowledge. How many previous owners had endured what he was experiencing now? How many had left without explanation, or worse, stayed too long? He made a decision. He would sell the house immediately, take whatever financial loss was necessary, and leave before whatever had claimed David Brennan could claim him. He contacted Patricia Moss, who seemed unsurprised by his sudden decision, and she listed the property without question. Ryan moved out on December 10th, renting an apartment in Strasbourg while waiting for the house to sell. But the phenomena did not stop. Objects in his apartment began moving on their own. Footsteps echoed through the rooms in the dead of night. The shadow appeared twice, standing silently in corners before vanishing. He realized, with growing horror, that whatever had been in that house had followed him. Or perhaps it had been waiting for him specifically, though he could not understand why. The house finally sold in January to a young couple from New Jersey who saw the same opportunity Ryan had once seen. He considered warning them, but could not find words that would not sound insane. In February, Ryan left Pennsylvania entirely, moving to Vermont, where he rented a small cottage and tried to rebuild his life. The disturbances gradually decreased in frequency, though they never ceased completely. Sometimes, late at night, he still hears footsteps. Sometimes, he still sees shadows that should not exist. And he wonders whether what he experienced was something trapped in that house, or something that had been waiting all along for the right person to set it free. The house in Tobyhanna remains occupied. The new owners have made no complaints. Perhaps they hear nothing. Or perhaps they simply have not been there long enough yet. Ryan will never know, and he has no intention of returning to find out. Haley Morrison had never been particularly interested in genealogy until her mother passed in the spring of 2019. Going through Margaret Morrison's belongings in the small McKissport home just outside Pittsburgh, Haley discovered boxes of family documents that her mother had collected over decades but never organized. There were birth certificates, marriage licenses, immigration papers, and photographs of stern-faced ancestors standing before houses that no longer existed. Haley, 38 and recently divorced with too much idle time, decided to honor her mother's memory by assembling a proper family tree. She began with what she knew. Her mother, Margaret, had been born in 1947 to Dorothy and Frank Sullivan in nearby Duquesne, a steel town that had thrived and then declined along with the industry that built it. Margaret had married Thomas Morrison in 1969, raising Haley and her younger brother Colin in the same house where Haley now sorted through decades of accumulated possessions. The deeper history, however, grew murkier with each layer she uncovered. Dorothy Sullivan had rarely spoken about her own childhood. By the time Haley was old enough to ask questions, her grandmother's mind had begun to betray her, dementia erasing memories before they could be passed down. Haley spent weeks scanning documents and uploading them to an ancestry website, weaving names and dates into a sprawling family tree that traced generations of Sullivans through Pennsylvania history. The line extended back to Irish immigrants who had arrived in the 1890s, settling in the coal regions north of Pittsburgh. The further back she dug, the more obsessed she became, staying awake into the early hours of the morning, following digital breadcrumbs through census records, old newspapers, and public archives. It was during one of these late-night sessions in July that Haley discovered the first mention of Walter Kensington. His name appeared in a 1972 issue of the Daily News in McKissport. A brief, almost forgotten report about a missing person. Walter Kensington, age 43, had been reported missing by his employer at Duquesne Steelworks on March 18, 1972. He had failed to appear for his shift and had vanished without a trace. The article noted that Kensington had lived alone in a boarding house on Grant Avenue. Police had opened an investigation, but had no leads. Haley might have brushed it off as irrelevant to her genealogical work, except for one chilling detail. The boarding house's address was 447 Grant Avenue, and according to the property records she had already examined, that address had been owned in 1972 by Dorothy and Frank Sullivan, her grandparents. They had held the building from 1968 until 1975, when they sold it and moved to a smaller home. Haley searched for follow-up articles about Walter Kensington, but found nothing. Missing person databases revealed his case was still open, unsolved after 47 years. Obituary records offered no death certificate, no sign that he had ever existed beyond the records of March 1972. Walter Kensington had simply vanished. The discovery unsettled Haley in ways she could not immediately articulate. Her grandmother, Dorothy, had died in 2003, taking with her any knowledge of what might have happened to a missing tenant. Her grandfather, Frank, had died even earlier, in 1989. Yet the coincidence felt too precise, too significant to dismiss. Determined to dig deeper, Haley sought any connection between Kensington and her grandparents beyond the landlord-tenant relationship. She found property tax records showing Dorothy and Frank had taken out a loan in April 1972, just 1 month after Kensington disappeared, to renovate the boarding house basement. A local history book briefly mentioned that 447 Grant Avenue had been converted from a boarding house into apartments in 1973. Among her mother's belongings, Haley uncovered an unlabeled, undated photograph. Her grandfather, Frank, standing in a basement, concrete dust clinging to his clothes, a grim expression etched on his face. She called her brother Colin in Denver. He laughed off her suspicions. Plenty of tenants had lived there over the years, he said. One disappearing was tragic, but hardly sinister. And the loan for basement renovations? Likely unrelated. Haley wanted to believe him, but the timeline gnawed at her. Every piece of information pointed back to March 1972 as a pivotal, unexplained moment in her grandparents' lives. She decided she needed to see 447 Grant Avenue for herself. The building still stood, though the neighborhood had fallen into decay since her grandparents' time. The 3-story brick structure had been divided into 6 apartments, now managed by a property company based in Pittsburgh. Haley explained to the current manager that her grandparents had once owned the building and that she was researching her family history. The manager, a tired-looking woman named Sandra Ua, gave Haley permission to look around the common areas, but explained that the apartments themselves were occupied. Access to those units would require tenant permission, which she could not grant. Haley descended to the basement, now a combination laundry and storage space. The concrete floor appeared relatively new, or at least newer than the building's original 1920s construction. The exposed brick walls had been painted white, and electrical wiring ran along the surface instead of being hidden behind the walls, suggesting later modifications. She scrutinized every inch of the floor, searching for irregularities, seams, or anything that suggested something might have been buried and covered over. The act felt absurd. Haley, a 48-year-old accountant, crawling around a basement with a flashlight, chasing a decades-old disappearance that might never have a resolution. Yet she could not shake the nagging conviction that Walter Kensington had not simply vanished. He had disappeared from a building her grandparents owned, and within a month, they had undertaken a substantial basement renovation. Over the following 2 months, Haley tracked down anyone who might have known her grandparents during that time. She located 3 former neighbors still living in McKaysport, all in their 80s and all with memories dulled by the passage of time. Edith Kowalski recalled Dorothy Sullivan as a nervous, increasingly withdrawn woman after 1972. Joseph Marks remembered that Frank Sullivan had handled the basement renovations himself rather than hiring contractors, a decision that had seemed unusual for such an extensive project. The third neighbor, Catherine Wu, did not recall the Sullivans personally, but remembered persistent rumors in the 1970s about problems at the Grant Avenue boarding house. In September, Haley enlisted the help of a private investigator named Marcus Webb, a former Pittsburgh police detective who specialized in cold cases. She handed him all her research, asking him to determine whether her suspicions had any grounding in reality. Webb took 2 weeks to compile his findings. When he finally called, his tone was careful, measured, and professional. But Haley could sense the concern lurking beneath his words. Webb had discovered that Walter Kensington had no living relatives and no close friends. He had been a solitary man, working long shifts at the steel mill and spending his evenings alone in his boarding house room. But Webb's research had uncovered something more disturbing. He had located the original police report from 1972, filed by Kensington's supervisor at the mill. According to the report, Kensington had confided to a co-worker on March 17, 1972, that he intended to confront his landlord about unpaid repairs and possible violations of building codes. He had specifically mentioned the basement, claiming it was being used for purposes that violated zoning regulations. Webb also discovered that Frank Sullivan had been interviewed by police during the missing person investigation. The interview notes were minimal. Frank stated that Kensington had paid rent through the end of March, packed up his belongings, and left without notice. He claimed to have no knowledge of Kensington's whereabouts. The police apparently accepted this explanation, concluding that Kensington, as an adult, had the right to disappear if he chose. But one detail made Haley's hands tremble as she held the phone. In June 1972, 3 months after Kensington vanished, a steel mill worker named Raymond Torres had filed a report alleging that Frank Sullivan had threatened him. According to Torres, Sullivan approached him in a bar and warned him to stop asking questions about Kensington, or Torres would regret it. Torres had been one of the few people who had known Kensington at the mill. The police noted Sullivan's denial of any threat, and the matter was eventually dropped. Haley sat in her living room, staring at a photograph of her grandfather Frank on the mantel. She remembered him as patient, kind, and full of gentle laughter. Sunday dinners, birthday presents. He had been her protector and guide. She could not reconcile that memory with the possibility that he had killed a man and buried the body beneath the basement floor. Determined to act, Haley contacted the McKeesport Police Department and requested to speak with someone about a cold case. She was transferred 3 times before reaching Detective Sarah Chen, who listened with professional interest. Chen explained that reopening a case from 1972 would require substantial evidence, not just circumstantial connections. But she agreed to review both the original file and Haley's research. 2 weeks later, Chen called back with news. The department had obtained a warrant to use ground-penetrating radar in the basement at 447 Grant Avenue. The scan revealed a clear anomaly beneath the concrete floor, an area roughly 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, where the soil density differed from its surroundings. They were seeking permission from the current building owner to excavate. Haley received the call on a Tuesday in November. Investigators had broken through the concrete in the southeastern corner of the basement. Buried approximately 4 feet below the surface, wrapped in plastic sheeting, were human remains. Dental records would take time, but the decomposition suggested the body had been interred in the early 1970s. 3 weeks later, the confirmation arrived. The remains were Walter Kensington. He had been killed by blunt force trauma to the head, then buried in the basement of the building where he had lived. The case was officially reopened as a homicide. But with both Frank and Dorothy Sullivan long deceased, there would be no criminal charges, no trial, no justice in the conventional sense. Over the following months, Haley learned more from the ongoing investigation. Detectives theorized that Frank Sullivan had confronted Kensington after learning about his plans to report code violations, and that the confrontation had turned violent. Dorothy, according to the investigation, had likely assisted in covering up the crime, which explained the behavioral changes neighbors had noticed after 1972. The basement renovation had been an attempt to permanently conceal the evidence. Haley arranged for Walter Kensington to receive a proper burial in a cemetery plot she purchased in McKeesport. She attended the small service with Detective Chen and Marcus Webb. There were no other mourners. Kensington had no family, no friends to speak for him, no one to remember the life he had lived before the tragedy. The story briefly made regional news. Haley declined all interview requests, unable to express the complex emotions swirling inside her. She had solved a 47-year-old mystery and given a missing man the dignity of a proper burial. But in doing so, she had shattered the image of her grandparents, reshaped her understanding of her family, and confronted a darkness she could never have imagined existed in her own history. She thought about her mother, Margaret, who must have known, or at least suspected, something about what her parents had done. She thought about all those family dinners, where the terrible secret had sat quietly at the table alongside ordinary conversations about the weather, work, and everyday concerns. Haley stopped working on the family tree. She boxed up the genealogy documents and stored them in her garage, unable to continue tracing a history now tainted by violence and lies. Some branches of a family tree, she realized, were better left unexplored. Some questions were better left unanswered. And some truths, once uncovered, changed everything about who you thought you were and where you came from. Adam Torres had been a police officer in Reading, Pennsylvania, for 11 years before accepting the position of sheriff in Alusing, a tiny town along the Susquehanna River in Bradford County. At 36, he was young for the role, but the town council had been desperate to fill the vacancy after Sheriff Harold Brennan had died unexpectedly of a heart attack while fishing at the old quarry. Adam had grown up in an urban environment where crime followed predictable patterns, and departmental support was always a radio call away. Alusing, with its population of barely 600 and a single-cell holding area masquerading as a jail, promised a quieter life, a reprieve from years of stress that had contributed to his divorce and worn him thin. He arrived in August 2018, moving his few belongings into the small apartment above the hardware store on Main Street. The town greeted him with cautious politeness, the kind of reserved reception given to outsiders in communities where families had lived side by side for generations. The mayor, Richard Davidson, who also ran the only gas station in town, gave Adam a tour of the town's limited facilities. He explained that Adam's primary duties would include responding to domestic disputes, checking on elderly residents during harsh weather, and occasionally dealing with teenagers who thought abandoned buildings made ideal places to drink beer. But Davidson had also mentioned the quarry, almost casually, as they drove past the access road leading east toward the Susquehanna River. He said locals no longer went near it, that it had been fenced off years ago, and that Adam should discourage curiosity seekers or urban explorers from investigating. When Adam asked why, Davidson had only said there had been accidents, that it was dangerous, and that everyone in Alusing knew to stay away. Adam let the subject drop at the time, but the warning lingered. During his first month, he noticed how the townspeople avoided even glancing toward the quarry access road. When he brought it up with Carol Henderson, the pleasant grandmother who ran the diner on Main Street, she grew visibly uneasy and changed the subject almost immediately. When he asked the postal carrier about the quarry's history, the man only shook his head and advised Adam to focus on other matters. Despite their caution, Adam's curiosity grew. The quarry, abandoned and whispered about, became impossible to ignore. Adam had been trained to investigate, to ask questions when something seemed deliberately hidden. In late September, during a slow afternoon when nothing was happening in town, he decided to drive out to the quarry and see for himself why it was such a forbidden topic. The access road was gated and chained, multiple no trespassing signs warning of dangerous conditions. But the gate was old, and the chain had rusted enough that Adam was able to force it open with minimal effort. He drove his patrol vehicle down the overgrown dirt road for roughly half a mile before it opened into a clearing where the quarry yawned like a wound in the landscape. The quarry had been a limestone operation. According to county historical records, it had operated from 1947 until 1983, supplying material for construction projects throughout the region. After it closed, it had been abandoned. The equipment had been removed, leaving only the massive excavation, a hole approximately 200 feet across and 60 feet deep. Rainwater had collected at the bottom, forming a dark pool that reflected the surrounding trees like glass. Adam parked and walked to the edge, peering down at the water. The sides were steep and eroded, evidence enough of the danger. He understood why children needed to be kept away, but that did not explain the extreme avoidance he had observed in town, the way people refused even to speak of it. As he turned to leave, something along the western edge caught his eye. Partially hidden by overgrowth were several wooden crosses, simple, weathered by years of sun and rain, some leaning at precarious angles. Adam counted 7, all unmarked, all positioned as if marking graves, though there was no visible evidence of burials. He photographed the crosses, leaving with more questions than answers. That evening, Adam visited Mayor Davidson at his home, a tidy ranch house on Elm Street. Davidson seemed unsurprised by Adam's presence, greeting him with resignation rather than hospitality. Inside, Davidson explained that the crosses marked the spots where 7 workers had died during the quarry's operation. 3 in a 1952 wall collapse, 2 in a 1968 explosion caused by faulty equipment, and 2 more in separate incidents in the late 1970s. The quarry had gained a reputation for being cursed, and workers had become increasingly reluctant to take jobs there. Its closure in 1983 had been driven as much by labor shortages as by economic factors. Adam asked why the bodies had never been moved to proper cemeteries. Davidson hesitated, then explained that the remains had never been recovered. The 1952 collapse had buried 3 men under tons of rock, and excavation would have been prohibitively expensive. The explosion in 1968 had been so violent that remains could not be fully recovered. The other deaths had occurred in machinery accidents or when unstable ground had given way. Situations where recovery was deemed too dangerous or outright impossible. Adam asked why the community had not at least erected proper memorials for the workers. Davidson had no good answer. Eventually, he admitted that people in Wysing preferred to forget the quarry entirely, that discussing it brought bad luck and some things were better left alone. Over the following weeks, Adam began digging deeper into the quarry deaths. He combed through old newspaper archives, discovering that reporting on the accidents had been minimal. Brief mentions of fatalities without any detailed investigation. He found no records of inquests, safety reviews, or official inquiries. The company that had operated the quarry, Susahana Materials Limited, had dissolved in 1984, and tracking down any surviving executives or workers proved challenging. Despite the obstacles, Adam located 3 former quarry employees still living in the region. The first, a man named Eugene Porter, now residing in Towanda, refused to speak with him. When Adam identified himself and explained his purpose, porter closed the door without a word, leaving Adam with more questions than answers. The second worker, Raymond Walsh, living in Surge, agreed to speak, but grew evasive the moment Adam asked about the deaths. Walsh insisted the accidents had been legitimate, that quarry work was inherently dangerous, and that fatalities were a routine risk in industrial settings. The third worker, Vincent Kowalski, residing in a nursing home in Elmira, New York, proved far more forthcoming. Kowalski was 86 years old, suffering from emphysema, and his voice barely rose above a rasp. But what he revealed to Adam changed everything. According to Kowalski, the deaths at the quarry had not been accidents. They had been murders. He claimed that Susquehanna Materials had been owned by a man named Thomas Wickersham, who controlled numerous businesses throughout Bradford County via shell companies and covert partnerships. Wickersham had been involved in smuggling along the Susquehanna River, transporting stolen goods and contraband, using the quarry as a distribution point. Workers who discovered the operation or threatened to report it had been systematically eliminated, their deaths staged as industrial accidents. Local authorities had been bribed or coerced into accepting these explanations without question. Kowalski admitted he had remained silent for decades out of fear. Now, confined to a nursing home far from Woozing and nearing the end of his life, he felt compelled to tell the truth. He provided Adam with names, dates, and detailed accounts of the smuggling operation. He explained how bodies had been disposed of in ways that made recovery impossible, and how many residents of Woozing had suspected the truth but remained silent. Intimidated by Wickersham's pervasive control over the town through employment and financial influence, Adam returned to Woozing armed with Kowalski's information and began quietly cross-referencing property records and old business licenses. He confirmed that Thomas Wickersham had indeed owned multiple enterprises across Bradford County from the 1950s through the 1980s. As he dug deeper, he discovered that several current business owners and local officials were either related to or financially tied to Wickersham's operations. Slowly, the reality sank in. He had uncovered a secret the entire community had conspired to bury, alongside the men who had died in the quarry. But Adam made a critical error. He was too obvious in his inquiries. Within 2 weeks of returning from Elmira, he began receiving warnings. Anonymous notes appeared on his patrol vehicle. Phone calls came in the dead of night, each ending with silence. His apartment was broken into while he was on duty. Nothing had been stolen, yet drawers were rifled, papers shifted, and personal items subtly rearranged. A clear, deliberate message. Mayor Davidson summoned him for a private meeting. Calm but firm, the mayor told Adam that investigating the quarry was beyond his duties. "You were hired to maintain peace in the present," Davidson said, "not to dig up the past." When Adam countered that 7 murders should not be ignored. No matter how long ago, Davidson's expression darkened. "Pursuing this could ruin your career and possibly your health," he warned. Frustrated and unnerved, Adam reached out to the Pennsylvania State Police, hoping his findings would prompt an investigation. He was met with bureaucracy and cautious skepticism. Without physical evidence or additional living witnesses beyond Kowalski, whose age and health made his reliability questionable, there was little the authorities could act upon. The system, it seemed, had no tools to confront decades-old crimes hidden by fear, corruption, and silence. The state police had advised Adam to focus on his present duties and leave the past buried. But he could not ignore what he had uncovered. Determined, he returned to the quarry, borrowing ground-penetrating radar equipment from a contact in Reading. For 2 days, he methodically scanned the perimeter and interior, searching for anomalies that might confirm his suspicions. The scans revealed several irregularities in the soil, potential burial sites. But verifying them would require excavation, a risky and complicated endeavor. The night after his second day at the quarry, 3 men appeared at his apartment. They refused to identify themselves, but Adam immediately recognized one as a cousin of Mayor Davidson. Their message was chillingly clear. He had a choice. He could leave wooing by the end of the week, accepting a $20,000 payout and signing a strict non-disclosure agreement regarding his investigation. Or he could remain and face consequences that were hinted at, but never explicitly stated. Adam spent the night weighing his options. He could continue, risking his life and career to expose crimes long concealed, potentially shaking the foundations of a town that had protected its secrets for decades. Or he could walk away, secure his safety, take the money, and allow the dead to remain unmourned, their killers shielded by time, fear, and complicity. By morning, his decision was made. He packed his belongings, accepted the payment, and left wooing. He moved back to Reading, using the funds to rebuild his life, eventually taking a position with a private security firm where moral ambiguities were fewer and stakes less personal. 3 months later, Vincent Kowalski died, taking with him the last living testimony of the quarry murders. The quarry remained fenced, abandoned, and largely forgotten. The wooden crosses still leaned against the earth, silent markers of men who had died and been left without justice, their stories buried alongside them in both soil and silence. Elusing continued as it always had. A quiet town along the river, where neighbors minded their own business and unspoken rules governed daily life. Adam tried to justify his choice for months afterward. He told himself that some battles could not be won, that exposing decades-old corruption would not bring the dead back, and that survival sometimes required compromise. Yet, in the dead of night, when sleep eluded him, his thoughts drifted to those 7 wooden crosses. He wondered how many other small towns across Pennsylvania hid similar secrets, buried in quarries, concealed by collective silence, protected by the tacit understanding that some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud. Nora Blackwell had been living with her roommate, Stephanie Chen, for 8 months when Stephanie vanished from their second-floor apartment in State College, Pennsylvania. The two had met through a roommate matching service affiliated with Penn State University. Nora was pursuing a graduate degree in environmental science, while Stephanie worked as a lab technician in the biology department. Their arrangement had been practical rather than deeply personal. 2 young women sharing expenses in a college town where rent was high. But over time, they had built a friendship based on mutual respect and compatible routines. The morning of November 7th, 2017, had been entirely unremarkable. Nora had left their apartment on Foster Avenue at 7:30 a.m. to teach an undergraduate lab section, leaving Stephanie at the kitchen table, eating breakfast and scrolling through her phone. Stephanie had mentioned that she had the day off from the lab and planned to run errands, or maybe drive to the mall in Altoona. When Nora returned that evening at 6:15, she expected the familiar sights of their shared life. Stephanie cooking dinner or curled up on the couch with the television on. Instead, the apartment was eerily silent. Stephanie's breakfast dishes still sat on the kitchen table. Her phone rested on the charger beside her bed. Her purse hung on the hook by the front door. And Stephanie's silver Honda Civic, normally parked in their designated spot behind the building, was gone. Everything about the scene suggested she had stepped out for a moment, planning to return any second. But she never did. Nora called Stephanie's phone repeatedly, listening to it ring in the bedroom, her anxiety mounting with every unanswered tone. She texted Stephanie's friends, desperate for any word, any clue. By 9 p.m., after more than 12 hours of silence, Nora contacted the State College Police Department to report her roommate missing. The responding officers, a man and a woman who introduced themselves as Officer David Martinez and Officer Sarah Chen, approached the situation with professional care. They asked about Stephanie's habits, her relationships, and any recent changes in behavior or mood. Nora explained that Stephanie had seemed perfectly normal that morning. No arguments, no tension, no signs of distress, and that she had no known history of mental health issues or impulsive behavior. The officers examined the apartment thoroughly, noting the phone and purse left behind, the untouched breakfast dishes, and the absence of any forced entry or signs of struggle. The unsettling conclusion was clear. Stephanie had disappeared without a trace. But Nora had noticed a subtle shift in the officers' expressions when they learned that Stephanie had taken her car. Officer Martinez had explained gently that adults had the right to leave if they chose, and that without evidence of foul play, the police could file a missing person report. But active investigation would be limited. Nora insisted that Stephanie leaving without her phone and purse made no sense. Something was clearly wrong. The officers promised to follow up and provided her with a case number before leaving. The investigation that followed was maddeningly minimal from Nora's perspective. 3 days later, police located Stephanie's car abandoned in a parking lot at the Nittany Mall in State College, only 4 miles from their apartment. The car was unlocked, keys still in the ignition, and there were no signs of disturbance inside. Security footage from the mall captured Stephanie parking at approximately 9:20 a.m. on the morning of November 7th. But the angle missed everything after she exited the vehicle. She simply walked out of frame and vanished. Within a week, the police attention shifted in a way that made Nora's stomach twist. Detectives began asking pointed questions about her relationship with Stephanie, whether they had argued, and in what she had been doing during the hours Stephanie disappeared. The questions were polite, professional, but their intent was clear. Nora realized with growing horror that she was being treated as a potential suspect in a case that the police apparently believed could be a homicide, despite the absence of a body or any concrete crime scene. The interrogations grew increasingly intense. Detectives pressed her about inconsistencies in her timeline, why she had not called the police sooner, and whether she and Stephanie had been romantically involved. They scrutinized her phone records, computer activity, and financial transactions. They even spoke with her professors and friends, asking questions that made Nora feel as though she were the one under suspicion, rather than someone desperate to find her missing roommate. Local news quickly picked up the story. Nora was repeatedly described as the last person to see Stephanie Chen alive, a phrase heavy with implication, as if the mere timing of her presence suggested guilt. Feeling trapped, Nora hired an attorney, Patricia Hernandez, a seasoned criminal defense lawyer. Hernandez advised her to stop speaking with police without legal representation, to meticulously document everything she remembered about November 7th, and to prepare for the terrifying possibility of being formally accused, even in the absence of any concrete evidence that a crime had occurred. The stress shattered Nora's ability to focus on her graduate work. She stopped attending classes, ignored emails, and spent her days confined to the apartment that now felt less like a home and more like both a crime scene and a prison. Yet despite the suffocating pressure and constant suspicion, she could not stop thinking about Stephanie. Her sudden disappearance, the abandoned phone and purse, and the haunting question that consumed every waking moment. Where had Stephanie gone? And why had she vanished without a trace? What had happened at the Nittany Mall that had driven Stephanie to abandon her car, her phone, and her purse? Nora, fueled partly by the need to clear her own name, but mostly by concern for her missing roommate, decided to begin her own investigation. With permission from Stephanie's parents, who had arrived from New Jersey the week after the disappearance, Nora carefully examined Stephanie's belongings. What she discovered immediately set off alarms. Hidden in a drawer in Stephanie's bedroom was a second phone, an old model that wasn't connected to any service plan. It contained a series of text messages from someone identified only as M. The messages discussed packages, deliveries, and payments, phrased vaguely enough to seem innocuous, but deliberate enough to make Nora uneasy. Even more concerning were Stephanie's bank statements. Over the past 6 months, she had made large, irregular cash deposits, sometimes $2,000, sometimes $3,000 at a time. With a modest annual salary of around $30,000 from her lab work, these deposits made no sense. Something was happening behind the surface of Stephanie's life, something hidden and possibly dangerous, and it might be connected to the day she vanished. When Nora presented her discoveries to the police, they thanked her politely, but treated the information as if it reinforced their suspicion that something criminal had occurred, and that she might have been involved. Frustrated and anxious, Nora realized she couldn't rely on the authorities to find answers. She had to investigate herself. She began reaching out to Stephanie's co-workers at the biology lab. Most declined to speak, wary of being caught in a police inquiry that already cast Nora as a suspect. One lab assistant, however, a young man named Kevin Torres, agreed to meet her off campus for coffee. Torres revealed that Stephanie had been acting unusually in the months leading up to her disappearance. She frequently skipped work without explanation and received phone calls that left her visibly anxious. Torres admitted he suspected Stephanie might have been involved in something illegal, though he had no proof. He also mentioned that Stephanie had been casually seeing a man she met online, someone she had been secretive about. She had only mentioned his name once, Marcus. Nora scoured Stephanie's computer and discovered an online dating profile under a username Stephanie had used elsewhere. The messages confirmed that she had indeed been communicating with a man named Marcus Hendris. Their last exchange had occurred on November 5th, just 2 days before her disappearance. Armed with this information, Nora informed her attorney, who passed it along to the police. Within days, detectives had located Marcus Hendris, a 34-year-old construction worker living in Belfonte. Marcus Hendris voluntarily came in for questioning. He admitted to a casual relationship with Stephanie, but insisted he had not seen or heard from her after November 5th. He explained that during their last meeting, they had argued about her reluctance to introduce him to friends or take their relationship more seriously. The police conducted a thorough investigation into Hendris, but found no evidence linking him to Stephanie's disappearance. As the weeks stretched into months, the case began to grow cold. There was no body, no crime scene, and no witnesses to any violent act. Nora remained under a cloud of suspicion, though she was never charged. Her semester suffered. Her grades fell, and her focus on graduate work all but vanished under the weight of constant stress. Leaving State College crossed her mind, but she feared it would only deepen the perception of guilt. Then, in March 2018, 4 months after Stephanie vanished, Nora received an anonymous email to her university account. It contained a single photograph. Stephanie standing on a sunny beach in a tropical location, alive and seemingly well, wearing sunglasses and casual clothing. Metadata confirmed the image had been captured on February 14th, 2018. The email included no text, explanation, or traceable sender. Nora immediately forwarded the photo to the police and to Stephanie's parents. Experts analyzed the image and confirmed its authenticity. It had not been manipulated or fabricated. Investigators were unable to determine where the photograph had been taken or who had sent it. Tracing the email proved impossible. It had passed through multiple servers and VPN connections that obscured its origin entirely. The photograph changed the entire perspective of the investigation. If Stephanie was alive in February, then no murder had occurred, and Nora could not possibly be responsible for a disappearance that had clearly been voluntary. Yet the image raised more questions than it answered. Why had Stephanie staged her own disappearance? Where was she now? Who had sent the photograph, and for what purpose? Nora's attorney suggested that Stephanie may have been involved in something illicit and had fled to avoid consequences. The irregular cash deposits, the secret phone, and the abandoned car all pointed to someone deliberately orchestrating their own disappearance, rather than someone being abducted or harmed. Police eventually closed the active investigation, reclassifying Stephanie's case as a voluntary missing person. Stephanie's parents, however, refused to accept that conclusion. They insisted their daughter would never have abandoned her life without warning them, would never have put them through the agony of believing she might be dead. They hired private investigators who followed leads across the country, chasing rumors and potential sightings that never produced concrete results. Nora graduated with her master's degree in 2019 and moved to Oregon for a position with an environmental consulting firm. She carried with her the weight of an experience that had fundamentally altered her understanding of trust and privacy. She often reflected on the 8 months she had shared with Stephanie, the conversations, shared meals, and ordinary moments of domestic life, and realized how little she had truly known about the person living just a room away. Sometimes, she wondered if Stephanie had planned her disappearance long before November 7th. If every detail of their roommate relationship had been calculated to provide cover for whatever she was really doing. Other times, Nora wondered if something had happened suddenly that had forced Stephanie to run. If the person in that beach photograph was living in freedom or in fear, the case remained officially unsolved. Anyone with information about Stephanie Chen's whereabouts was asked to contact the State College Police Department. But as the years passed with no new developments, the case faded from public attention, becoming just another file in a cabinet full of people who had chosen to vanish from their old lives and start again somewhere new, for reasons known only to themselves. Tyler Brennan had taken a job as a technical writer for a small environmental consulting firm, specifically because it allowed him to work remotely from anywhere with a reliable internet connection. At 29, he had grown weary of Philadelphia's noise and high costs. When he discovered he could rent an entire house in Emporium, Pennsylvania, for less than half what he paid in the city, the decision seemed obvious. Emporium sat deep in the Pennsylvania wilderness, a region of dense forest and isolated communities in Cameron County, where fewer than 5,000 people were spread across nearly 400 square miles. Tyler moved there in September 2019, driving his packed Honda through increasingly remote landscapes until he reached the small town that would be his home for the foreseeable future. The house he rented was a modest 2-story structure on Spruce Street, within walking distance of the tiny downtown, which consisted of a grocery store, a diner, a post office, and a handful of other businesses that seemed to exist more from habit than from economic necessity. The landlord, an elderly man named Frank Morrison, who lived in Williamsport, had been grateful to find a tenant willing to sign a year-long lease. He explained that many properties in Emporium sat vacant because young people moved away for work and retirees preferred towns with better medical facilities. What Tyler had not known when he signed the lease, what Frank Morrison had not mentioned, and what did not appear in any online description of the town, was that Emporium had experienced an unusual number of disappearances over the past 4 decades. He learned about this pattern gradually, through conversations and observations that accumulated into a disturbing picture of a community haunted by unexplained absences. The first hint came during his second week in town, when Tyler stopped at the diner for breakfast. He had been reading a local history book he found at the small public library and asked the waitress, a woman in her 50s named Barbara Chen, about some of the families mentioned in the book. Barbara had been friendly until Tyler mentioned the name Catherine Walsh. Her expression shifted instantly, tightening, guarded. She said only that the Walsh family had left town years ago and suggested Tyler read something more current. The abrupt change in demeanor was so jarring that Tyler remembered it clearly. The second incident occurred in October, when Tyler had been exploring the hiking trails surrounding Emporium. He had gotten turned around in the woods and emerged near a cemetery he had not known existed. Walking among the gravestones, he noticed something unusual. Multiple headstones listed only names and birth years, with no death dates. He counted 7 of them scattered throughout the cemetery, all for people born between 1950 and 1980. When he mentioned this to his landlord during a phone call about a plumbing issue, Frank Morrison went silent for several seconds before abruptly changing the subject. Tyler's curiosity deepened. Driven by the same investigative habits that had made him good at researching and writing technical reports, he began digging into local records. Newspaper archives revealed brief articles about missing persons dating back to 1977. The first was a young woman, Jennifer Walsh, age 19, who had disappeared in August 1977 while walking home from her job at a lumber mill. The second was a man, David Torres, age 42, who vanished in 1983 after telling his wife he was going to check on hunting equipment in the woods. The pattern continued through the decades. Roughly 1 disappearance every few years, always involving people last seen on the outskirts of town or in the surrounding forest. By November, Tyler had documented 17 cases spanning from 1977 to 2016. The most recent disappearance was a college student named Marcus Hicks, who had been visiting family in Emporium during Christmas break and had gone for a hike on December 27, 2016. He never returned. Despite extensive searches involving state police and volunteer searchers, no trace of him was ever found. What made the pattern even more disturbing was the lack of sustained attention or investigation. Each disappearance had been reported and searched briefly, then quietly closed as unsolved. There were no task forces, no special inquiries, and no acknowledgement that 17 people vanishing from a town of only 1,500 residents over 40 years represented a statistical impossibility, unless something deliberate or systematic was occurring. Tyler attempted to discuss his findings with locals, only to encounter resistance ranging from uneasy silence to outright hostility. The librarian, when asked about historical records, claimed many documents had been lost in a flood years earlier. The grocery store owner, when Tyler casually mentioned the disappearances, suggested he might be happier living elsewhere if he was going to dwell on negative history. Even the local police chief, Robert Daniels, whom Tyler encountered at the post office, was dismissive when Tyler raised the pattern, insisting that people went missing in rural areas all the time, and that the phenomenon was not as unusual as outsiders might think. The unified response, the avoidance, the deflection, the silent warnings, troubled Tyler more than the disappearances themselves. The reaction suggested more than ignorance. It hinted at active suppression, a community-wide agreement to avoid acknowledging the disappearances that had plagued Emporium for decades. Tyler considered leaving, even taking Frank Morrison up on the offer to break the lease early if he was unhappy. But something kept him investigating. A mix of stubbornness, curiosity, and genuine concern that people were being lost while no one with authority seemed to care. In December, Tyler stumbled across something that shifted the nature of his investigation entirely. He had been hiking one of the trails north of town, carrying his GPS and camera to document the area, when he noticed an unusual pattern in the forest. The trail followed an old logging road through dense hemlock trees. At several points, Tyler observed that the trees nearest the road were significantly younger than the surrounding forest. Examining the stumps, he realized they had been cut relatively recently, perhaps within the past 20 years. Following one of these areas of younger growth off the main trail, Tyler discovered a clearing that did not appear on any map he had consulted. In the center stood a partially collapsed structure, overgrown with vegetation, resembling a small cabin or storage building. He photographed the site and cautiously explored the area. Among the debris, he found remnants of camping equipment and empty food containers, with dates spanning multiple years. A discovery that sent a chill down his spine. Most shockingly, he uncovered a wallet containing identification for David Torres, the man who had disappeared in 1983. Tyler immediately hiked back to town, wallet in hand, and went straight to the police station. Chief Daniels was present despite it being a Sunday afternoon. Expecting concern, or at least curiosity, Tyler showed him the wallet and explained where it had been found. Daniels studied it silently for a long moment before looking at Tyler with an expression that was impossible to read. Leaving Tyler uncertain of what would come next, Chief Daniels asked Tyler to show him exactly where he had discovered the structure. Tyler agreed, and they drove together in the police cruiser to the trailhead. But when they hiked to the clearing, everything was different. The collapsed structure remained, but it had been cleared of debris. The camping equipment was gone. The food containers were gone. When Daniels examined the wallet Tyler had found, he dismissed it, claiming the identification looked fake, the photo quality was inconsistent with 1983, and that someone was probably playing a prank. Tyler knew what he had seen. He knew the wallet had been real. Standing in that clearing with Daniels, who now suggested they return to town before dark, Tyler realized he had crossed an invisible line. He had uncovered evidence of something that Emporium's residents did not want revealed, and the response had been both swift and calculated. That night, Tyler's house was broken into while he slept. Nothing was stolen, but his computer and external hard drive, where all his research on the disappearances had been stored, were gone. His phone, left charging in the kitchen, had been smashed beyond repair. When he reported the break-in the next morning, a different officer took the report and promised to investigate. But Tyler suspected no real follow-up would occur. He bought a new phone and spent the following week trying to reconstruct his research from memory and online archives. Many of the newspaper articles he had previously accessed were no longer available through the library's digital portal, and the librarian claimed ignorance regarding their removal. In mid-December, Tyler received an unannounced visit from Frank Morrison, the landlord who had never previously come to Emporium during Tyler's tenancy. Over coffee, Morrison suggested that Tyler might want to consider moving back to Philadelphia. "The town is not for everyone," he said, his tone calm but warning enough. "Some people found the isolation unsettling," Morrison said. He offered to return Tyler's full security deposit and waive the remaining months on his lease if Tyler agreed to leave Emporium by the end of the year. Tyler asked him directly whether he knew about the disappearances, whether there was something in Emporium that people were deliberately covering up. Morrison stared at his coffee for a long time before speaking. He explained that some places had histories outsiders could not comprehend. Communities sometimes made decisions about what to remember and what to forget. and Tyler should be very careful pushing against doors that others wanted kept firmly closed. Tyler left Emporium on December 22nd, 2019. He packed all his belongings into his car and drove back to Philadelphia, moving into a cramped sublet and attempting to resume the life he had paused 4 months earlier. But he could not stop thinking about the 17 people who had vanished from that small town in the Pennsylvania wilds. He thought about the community that had closed ranks around whatever truth explained their disappearances, and about the wallet from 1983 that had sat in a collapsed structure for decades, only for someone to remove it again within hours of discovery. Tyler attempted several times to interest journalists in the story, sending his reconstructed research to reporters at regional newspapers and television stations. His efforts were met only with polite acknowledgments. He contacted the Pennsylvania State Police and was told that, without new evidence or credible leads, cold cases from decades past could not be prioritized. He posted about his experiences on forums dedicated to unsolved mysteries and missing persons, but his accounts were met with more skepticism than concern. Eventually, Tyler stopped actively investigating. He kept copies of the limited documentation he had managed to preserve, but he moved on with his life, accepting a new job and trying to forget the months he had spent in a town where 17 people had vanished, and no one would acknowledge that anything unusual had occurred. Still, late at night, Tyler sometimes searched online for news from Emporium, hoping for reports of new disappearances or that someone else might notice the pattern and succeed where he had failed in forcing the community to confront its hidden truths. The searches never revealed anything. Emporium remained as it had always been, a quiet, remote town in Pennsylvania where nothing remarkable seemed to happen, and where those who asked too many questions learned quickly to leave before they became part of a history no one wanted to discuss. Victoria Brennan had never been close to her Aunt Diane, who lived alone in a deteriorating Victorian house in New Hope, Bucks County, Pennsylvania, for as long as Victoria could remember. Diane was her father's younger sister, a woman who had chosen solitude over family connections and had declined invitations to holidays and birthdays with such consistency that, eventually, the invitations stopped coming altogether. When Diane died in February 2020 at age 73 from complications of pneumonia, Victoria was surprised to learn she had been named the sole beneficiary of Diane's estate, which consisted primarily of the house on Mechanic Street and whatever belongings remained inside. Victoria, 31, and working as a paralegal in Philadelphia, drove to New Hope on a cold Saturday in March to assess her inheritance. The house looked far worse than she remembered from childhood visits decades earlier. The paint had long since peeled from the clapboard siding, exposing weathered wood beneath. Several windows were cracked or broken. The front porch sagged in the middle, and the yard was overrun with weeds that had pushed through what had once been carefully tended landscaping. Despite Diane having lived there until her hospitalization 2 weeks before her death, the house looked abandoned rather than recently occupied. Inside, the situation was even more dire. Diane had apparently become a hoarder in her later years, filling every room with newspapers, magazines, boxes, and random objects that created narrow, maze-like pathways through otherwise impassable spaces. The smell of mildew and decay permeated every corner. Victoria stood in the front hallway, fighting back tears, overwhelmed by the monumental task of cleaning, cataloging, and preparing the house for sale or proper evaluation. She spent the day making preliminary assessments, photographing rooms, and creating lists of what would need to be done. The kitchen was a health hazard, with decades of grime coating every surface. Bathroom fixtures were corroded beyond repair. Furniture was either water damaged or infested with insects. Victoria was mentally calculating demolition costs when she noticed something unusual at the end of the second-floor hallway. The wall showed a seam that did not match the surrounding construction, as if a doorway had been sealed with drywall and painted over to blend in. Victoria had studied the estate document's floor plan, which showed 4 bedrooms on the second floor. But when she counted the doors, she found only 3. This hidden doorway would lead to the 4th bedroom, the one shown on the original architectural drawings, but missing from the actual layout of the house. She called a contractor the following Monday, a man named Robert Chen, who specialized in historic renovations. Chen came that Wednesday, examined the wall, and confirmed a doorway had been closed off, likely in the 1980s based on the drywall and tape compound used. When Victoria asked him to open it, Chen hesitated, cautioning her about discovering a space someone had deliberately sealed. Victoria insisted, and Chen agreed to return on Saturday with his tools. The work took less than an hour. Chen carefully cut through the drywall, revealing the old door frame. The door itself was still in place behind the wall, locked with a deadbolt that had been painted over multiple times. Chen drilled out the lock mechanism, and the door swung inward with a creak that suggested it had not moved in decades. The room beyond measured approximately 12 by 14 feet, with a single window boarded over from the inside. When the door opened, a musty, paper-laden scent escaped, mingled with something Victoria could not immediately identify. Temporary work lights illuminated the space, revealing a room that felt like a cross between an archive and a shrine. The walls were covered with photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes, all preserved behind sheets of plastic stapled to the walls. Cardboard boxes labeled with names and date ranges covered the floor. At the center, on a folding table, sat what looked like evidence. Clothing sealed in plastic bags, jewelry arranged in labeled containers, and 3 ring binders filled with surveillance photographs. Victoria stood frozen in the doorway, while Chen surveyed the room. He suggested they contact the police before touching anything. Victoria, hands shaking, dialed the New Hope Police Department. Within 20 minutes, 2 officers arrived. After examining the room and its contents, they called their supervisor, who in turn contacted the Bucks County District Attorney's office. By evening, Victoria's inherited house had become a full-fledged crime scene. Investigators meticulously photographed every item and documented the contents of the sealed room. What they uncovered was evidence of a murder that had occurred 35 years earlier, in 1985. The victim was a young woman named Catherine Walsh, 22 years old, who had been found dead in her Doylestown apartment on August 14th. She had been strangled, and her apartment ransacked in what police at the time had assumed was a robbery gone wrong. The case went cold after initial investigations failed to identify any suspects. The room in Diane's house contained materials that had never been submitted to law enforcement. There were photographs of Catherine taken without her knowledge in the weeks leading up to her death, images showing her at work, at home, and running errands. Handwritten notes detailed her schedule, habits, and routines. There was clothing apparently taken from Catherine's apartment, including a distinctive scarf mentioned in the original police report as missing from the crime scene. Most disturbing were Diane's journals. They contained detailed accounts revealing an obsessive fixation on Catherine Walsh. The entries described watching her, following her, and fantasizing about confronting her. The final entries, written in the days following the murder, conveyed a casual, horrifying satisfaction at what had been done. Victoria spent 3 days being interviewed by detectives, answering questions about her aunt and whether she had known anything of Diane's activities. Investigators learned that Diane and Catherine had briefly worked together at a bookstore in New Hope in 1984. Catherine had apparently rebuffed Diane's attempts at friendship, triggering an obsession that escalated into murder. Detectives uncovered additional evidence in the sealed room that definitively linked Diane to the crime. Hair and fiber samples collected in 1985, but never properly analyzed, were re-examined using modern DNA techniques. The results confirmed Diane had been present in Catherine's apartment at the time of her death. Handwriting analysis matched the threatening notes sent to Catherine in the weeks before her murder, with samples of Diane's writing found throughout the house. The case was officially resolved on April 22nd, 35 years after Catherine Walsh had been killed. Diane Brennan was identified posthumously as the murderer, though she would never face trial or punishment for her actions. Catherine's family, who had spent decades searching for answers, were notified of the breakthrough. They expressed relief and gratitude that the case had been solved, but also sorrow that justice had come too late to be meaningful. Victoria struggled to process the revelation. She had inherited not just a house, but a decades-old secret of murder committed by a woman she had known, albeit distantly, throughout her childhood. She reflected on past family gatherings Diane had avoided, wondering whether her aunt's reclusion had been driven by guilt over the crime or by fear of being discovered. She thought about the sealed room and what it meant that Diane had kept the evidence rather than destroying it. As if the documentation of the crime had been too important to discard. The house could not be sold until the investigation was complete. The sealed room remained off-limits for weeks while forensic teams processed every item. Victoria hired a company specializing in trauma scene cleanup to handle the eventual restoration, unable to imagine doing the work herself, knowing what the house had contained. By summer, the investigation concluded, and the house was returned to Victoria's control. She decided to have it demolished rather than renovated, unable to imagine anyone living there with knowledge of its history. The demolition took place in August 2020, 5 months after Victoria had first opened that sealed door. Catherine Walsh's family held a memorial service, which Victoria attended, feeling obligated to represent her family in acknowledging the harm Diane had caused. Catherine's sister, Rebecca, spoke about the decades of uncertainty, the theories and suspicions that had tormented the family, and the relief of finally having answers. Even though those answers came too late to bring Catherine back or hold her killer accountable, Victoria sold the empty lot in November for significantly less than the property would have been worth with the house intact. She used part of the proceeds to establish a scholarship fund in Catherine Walsh's name at the community college, where Catherine had been studying nursing before her death. It was a small gesture, one that could never balance the scales of what Diane had taken and what Victoria had unknowingly inherited, along with that deteriorating Victorian house. The case made local news and was covered by several true crime podcasts, with Victoria identified only as the niece who had discovered the evidence. She declined all interview requests, unwilling to profit from or sensationalize what had happened. 6 months later, she left her paralegal position in Philadelphia for work with a nonprofit in Baltimore, seeking distance and a fresh start. But sometimes Victoria still thought about that sealed room and what it represented. A life taken and a secret kept for 35 years in a space measuring only 12 by 14 feet. She thought about how close the evidence had come to being lost forever if Diane had died even a few years earlier, when she might still have had the physical capacity to destroy what she had preserved. And she wondered how many other sealed rooms existed in houses across Pennsylvania and beyond, containing evidence of crimes that would remain unsolved until chance or inheritance brought them to light. Evan Torres had been driving home from a conference in Cleveland when his GPS rerouted him through back roads in western Pennsylvania due to an accident on Interstate 80. It was just past 11 p.m. on a Tuesday in March 2021, and the roads through Lawrence County were dark and nearly empty. Evan, 33, worked as a sales manager for a pharmaceutical company and had been looking forward to getting home to his apartment in Harrisburg and sleeping in his own bed after 3 days of conference hotels and business dinners. He was driving along Route 18 near the Ohio border, about 15 miles south of Newcastle, when he saw a car pulled over on the shoulder with its hazard lights flashing. Years of his mother's warnings about helping strangers warred with his sense that leaving someone stranded on a dark road was wrong. The car was a newer model sedan, the kind that did not immediately suggest criminal intent. And when Evans slowed down, he could see a figure standing beside the driver's door, clearly illuminated by his headlights. He pulled over ahead of the disabled vehicle and approached cautiously, phone in hand, with the emergency call screen ready just in case. The man appeared to be in his 40s, dressed in business casual clothing, looking more frustrated than threatening. He introduced himself as Marcus Chen and explained that his car had simply died, all electrical systems failing at once. He had been trying to call a tow truck, but had no cell service in the area. He asked Evan if he could give him a ride to the next town, or at least somewhere with phone reception so he could make arrangements. Evan agreed, feeling reasonably confident the situation was legitimate. They walked back to Evan's car together, Marcus carrying a small overnight bag and continuing to complain about the timing of the breakdown and how it was going to ruin his schedule the next day. They were nearly to Evan's vehicle when Marcus suddenly stopped and grabbed Evan's arm. That was when Evan heard it. A faint, deliberate thumping coming from Marcus's car trunk. He looked up at Marcus, whose expression had changed completely, the frustration replaced by something unreadable and tense. The frustration had been replaced with something harder, more calculating. Marcus told Evan to keep walking, his grip on Evan's arm tightening in a way that left no question. It was a threat, not a request. Evan's mind raced. He was only 30 feet from his car, but Marcus was blocking the way to the driver's door. His phone was still in his hand, but with Marcus holding him, he couldn't dial. The thumping from the trunk continued. Someone was clearly signaling for help. Acting on instinct, Evan twisted free and ran. Not toward the car, but into the darkness of the field beside the road. Marcus shouted, but Evan didn't pause. He barreled through tall grass and uneven ground, hearing the heavy crashing of Marcus behind him. He held his phone high, scanning desperately for signal. After what felt like endless seconds, a single bar appeared. Without slowing, he hit the emergency call button. Route 18, south of Newcastle. He gasped into the 911 line between gasps. Man with someone trapped in his trunk. Police, now. The operator told him to stay on the line. But Evan could hear Marcus closing in. He ended the call to preserve battery and kept running, angling toward the road further south, hoping Marcus couldn't see him. Half a mile later, he reached the road, lungs burning, legs trembling. He slowed only slightly, scanning the dark road for headlights, any sign that help was coming. Evan stood on the shoulder, torn between flagging down a passing car or hiding in case Marcus circled back looking for him. Before he could decide, the wail of sirens cut through the night. 2 Pennsylvania State Police cruisers appeared, lights slicing through the darkness. Evan stepped onto the road, waving frantically. The closest cruiser skidded to a stop. The troopers listened to his account with sharp, professional focus. One radioed for backup, while the other jotted detailed notes about Marcus and his vehicle. Within minutes, additional units arrived, and a coordinated plan was set. Evan was told to wait with one trooper as the others moved north to locate the sedan and the person trapped in the trunk. 30 agonizing minutes passed. Evan sat in the back of the cruiser, watching more law enforcement vehicles, marked and unmarked, arrive. Sirens silent, but lights spinning, signaling the intensity of the response. Finally, one of the initial troopers returned. "We found the car. The person in the trunk is safe," he said. "Marcus Chen, if that's even his real name, has fled on foot. We've got units and dogs searching the area." Evan was driven to the scene. Multiple police vehicles surrounded the disabled sedan. In the back of an ambulance sat a young woman, wrapped in a blanket, her hair disheveled and bruises visible on her face and arms. When she saw Evan, tears streamed down her face. She looked at the officer beside her. Can I speak to him?" The officer nodded, and Evan approached. The woman, Rachel Morrison, pressed her hands together and whispered through sobs, "Thank you. Thank you so much." Rachel explained that Marcus, whose real name investigators later confirmed was Gregory Walsh, had abducted her from a Youngstown, Ohio parking lot earlier that evening. She had been walking to her car after her shift at a restaurant when Walsh forced her into his vehicle at knife point. He had driven for over an hour before the car experienced a complete electrical failure. When he pulled over, Rachel had kicked at the trunk, hearing voices outside and realizing that someone might actually be nearby to help. Evan stayed at the scene for the next 2 hours, giving detailed statements to multiple investigators. They informed him that Walsh was wanted in Ohio for 2 previous abductions over the past 6 months. One victim had survived, held captive for 3 days before escaping. The other, a 26-year-old woman named Jennifer Torres, remained missing and was presumed dead based on evidence discovered at a property Walsh had rented. Detective Sarah Chen, leading the Pennsylvania State Police investigation, told Evan that his decision to run rather than comply with Walsh likely saved both his and Rachel's lives. Walsh had intended to move Rachel to a secondary location where he would have had more control and privacy. If Evan had entered the car as Walsh demanded, or if he had simply driven past, the outcome might have mirrored Jennifer Torres's fate. The timing of the car breakdown and Evan's choice to intervene had created a narrow window for rescue that might never come again. Walsh was apprehended 6 hours later, hiding in a barn approximately 3 miles from the disabled vehicle. He was charged with kidnapping, assault, and attempted murder in Pennsylvania, with additional charges pending in Ohio connected to his prior crimes. Rachel received treatment for her injuries and was released to her family. She later testified at Walsh's trial 11 months afterward, recounting her ordeal and emphasizing that Evan's intervention had saved her life. Evan struggled with the aftermath in ways he had not anticipated, wrestling with the lingering adrenaline, the moral weight of what had transpired, and the knowledge that a single decision had prevented tragedy. Evan had nightmares about what might have happened if he had not stopped, if he had stepped into Walsh's car, or if his phone hadn't managed to find a signal at the critical moment. He thought constantly about Jennifer Torres, whose body was eventually discovered buried on property Walsh had been using in rural Ohio. He attended Walsh's sentencing hearing, where Walsh received multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. Yet Evan felt no satisfaction. One life had already been lost, and nothing could undo that. Rachel kept in touch, sending messages on holidays and the anniversary of her rescue. She told Evan she was attending therapy, working through her trauma, but determined to finish college and pursue a career as a social worker specializing in helping crime victims. Evan found some solace in knowing she was reclaiming the life Walsh had tried to take. Yet the events of that night had changed him. He could no longer drive past someone stranded without stopping, despite knowing the risks. He installed a dash cam in his car, carried pepper spray, and ensured he had a reliable phone charger at all times. He took self-defense classes and became vigilant, learning to notice warning signs he had once ignored. Evan reflected often on the randomness of it all. If the conference had ended an hour earlier or later, if the accident on Interstate 80 had not rerouted him, if Walsh's car had not failed at precisely that location, if he had chosen a different route or decided not to stop, the entire sequence would have been altered. One split-second decision had determined life or death, and he carried the weight of that truth with him every day. Evan had nightmares about what might have happened if he hadn't stopped, if he had gotten into Walsh's car, or if his phone hadn't managed to find a signal when he needed it. He thought constantly about Jennifer Torres, whose body was eventually discovered buried on property Walsh had been using in rural Ohio. He attended Walsh's sentencing hearing, where Walsh received multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. But Evan felt no satisfaction. One victim was still dead, and nothing could change that. Rachel stayed in contact, sending messages on holidays and the anniversary of her rescue. She told Evan she was in therapy, working through her trauma, but determined to finish college and pursue a career as a social worker, specializing in helping crime victims. Evan found some comfort in knowing she was rebuilding the life Walsh had tried to steal from her, yet the experience had left its mark. Evan found he could no longer drive past someone stranded without stopping, even though every rational part of his mind told him it was dangerous. He installed a dash cam in his car, carried pepper spray, and kept a reliable phone charger at all times. He took self-defense classes and learned to notice warning signs he had once overlooked. He thought often about the randomness of it all. If the conference had ended an hour earlier or later, if the accident on Interstate 80 had not rerouted him, if Walsh's car had not failed at precisely that spot, if he had chosen a different route or decided not to stop, the entire sequence would have unfolded differently. One split-second choice had determined life or death, and Evan carried the weight of that truth every day. Rachel Morrison might have disappeared, another name added to a list of victims. Her family could have been left with decades of unanswered questions. Detective Chen had told Evan that he was a hero, that his actions had directly saved a life and led to the capture of a dangerous predator. But Evan did not feel heroic. He felt lucky, frightened, and acutely aware of the violence that often lurked just beneath the surface of ordinary moments. He had stopped to help someone with car trouble, one of the most common scenarios on any highway, and stumbled into a situation that could easily have ended with him as a victim rather than a rescuer. The case received moderate media coverage, with Evan's identity protected at his request. He declined interview requests from news programs and true crime podcasts. Unwilling to relive the experience or have it define him publicly, he returned to his job and routine. Though both now felt altered, colored by the knowledge of what he had witnessed and what might have been. Sometimes, late at night, when he could not sleep, Evan thought about Jennifer Torres, whose family would never receive the closure that Rachel Morrison's family had. He thought about how many other Gregory Walshes existed, driving through Pennsylvania, Ohio, and beyond, waiting for opportunities that car trouble, isolated roads, and human kindness provided. And he wondered whether his mother had been right all along about the dangers of helping strangers, even as he knew he would continue to stop for stranded motorists, because the alternative was letting fear govern every decision and allowing people like Rachel Morrison to be left to their fate. Hannah Brennan was 7 years old when her sister Emily walked into the woods behind their house in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and never came back. It was August 15th, 1991. a Thursday afternoon during summer vacation, the kind of oppressive heat where humidity made every breath feel heavy. Emily was 14, old enough to be trusted in the woods that bordered their property in the Lehigh Valley. Woods she had explored countless times since the family had moved there when Hannah was 2. Hannah remembered that afternoon in fragments, images, and sensations frozen in her memory over decades. Emily had been sitting on the back porch, reading a magazine, wearing cut-off denim shorts and a purple tank top. Their mother, Patricia, had been inside preparing dinner, the sound of running water and clattering dishes drifting through the open kitchen window. Their father, Thomas, was at the steel plant on his 4 to midnight shift, part of the rhythm that structured their family life. Hannah had been playing with dolls in the shade of the oak tree that dominated the backyard. Emily looked up from her magazine and announced she was going for a walk. She did this often, disappearing into the woods for an hour or two with a book or her Walkman, seeking the privacy their small house, with its shared bedrooms, could not provide. From the kitchen window, Patricia called out that Emily should be back before dinner at 6. Emily waved and walked across the lawn toward the tree line, where a well-worn path led into the forest. Hannah watched her sister disappear between the trees, the purple tank top visible for just a few more seconds before the dense summer foliage swallowed her entirely. It was the last time anyone in the Brennan family saw Emily alive. When 6 o'clock came and Emily had not returned, Patricia called her from the back porch. Silence. At 6:15, she walked into the woods along the familiar path, calling Emily's name with growing urgency. By 6:30, she returned alone and called Thomas at the plant. By 7, he was home, organizing a search with neighbors. By 8, the Bethlehem Police Department had become involved. The search stretched through the night and into the following day. Police and volunteers combed the woods in systematic grid patterns. The forest spanned roughly 200 acres and backed up to state game lands that stretched for miles. They found nothing. No clothing, no signs of struggle, no indication that Emily had been in the woods, despite the path she had walked hundreds of times before. On the 3rd day, search dogs were brought in. They tracked Emily's scent from the house to a point about half a mile into the woods, where the path met an abandoned logging road, long, unused, and overgrown. There, the dogs lost the trail completely, as if Emily had vanished into thin air or been taken by a vehicle. But no tire tracks were visible. The investigation consumed the next year of Hannah's childhood, leaving a shadow that would never fully lift. Detectives interviewed everyone who had known Emily, her classmates, her teachers, the cashiers at the stores she frequented. They combed her room for clues, notes, letters, or signs she might have been planning to run away or communicating with someone who could have lured her into danger. They found nothing. Emily had been an ordinary teenager. Good grades, a normal social life, no boyfriend, no conflicts suggesting she would leave voluntarily. Theories multiplied. Some believed Emily had been abducted by a stranger, perhaps someone driving the old logging road looking for opportunities. Others suggested she might have suffered an accident in the woods and wandered off, eventually dying somewhere the searchers had not reached. The most painful speculation, whispered quietly in the community, was that Emily had run away due to problems at home. Though investigators found no evidence of abuse or family conflict, months turned into years, and the case grew cold. The Brennan family fractured under the weight of uncertainty. Thomas drank more heavily and buried himself in long hours at the steel plant, avoiding the house where Emily's absence was an ever-present void. Patricia sank into severe anxiety and depression, unrelieved by any treatment. And Hannah, who had lost her sister and then watched her parents retreat into grief, grew up in a house that felt more like a memorial than a home. Then felt so haunted by someone who might still be alive somewhere, or perhaps gone forever. Hannah left Bethlehem at 18, attending college in Pittsburgh before building a career in social work in Philadelphia. She married, divorced, and crafted a life deliberately separate from the tragedy that had defined her childhood. Yet she never stopped thinking about Emily, never stopped wondering what had happened in those woods on August 15th, 1991. By 2021, 30 years after Emily's disappearance, Hannah was 47 and working as a supervisor at a nonprofit serving homeless youth. Her mother had died 3 years earlier, still haunted by unanswered questions. Her father had followed 6 months later, his body broken by decades of drinking. Hannah had inherited the house in Bethlehem, renting it out for years, but had never found the heart to sell it. That summer, she made the decision to return. She would renovate the house in preparation for sale, taking a leave of absence from work and moving back into the home where she had grown up. She slept in her old bedroom while contractors updated the kitchen and bathrooms. It was during that renovation, amid dust and the smell of fresh paint, that she resolved to finally go through the boxes her parents had stored in the attic. The boxes were ones Hannah had avoided when sorting through her parents' belongings after their deaths. Among her mother's things, she discovered a journal Patricia had kept during the years following Emily's disappearance. The pages were heavy with grief, guilt, and desperate prayers for her daughter's return. Reading them was like stepping into her mother's heartbreak, a vivid reminder of the void that had haunted the family for decades. Toward the end of the journal, entries from 1997, 6 years after Emily vanished, carried a different tone. Patricia wrote of a phone call she had received from a woman claiming to have information about Emily. The caller refused to give her name, but insisted that Emily had not been taken by a stranger. She had been taken by someone local, someone well-connected in Bethlehem, someone whose involvement had been quietly protected by those in authority. Patricia had reported the call to the police, but the detective she spoke with dismissed it as a crank call, a cruel trick on a grieving mother. Patricia did not accept that explanation. She began her own investigation, quietly asking questions, seeking clues, trying to identify who could have been responsible. The journal detailed meetings with former neighbors and Emily's old friends, every interaction noted with painstaking care. As if her mother had been constructing a map of secrets the rest of the town wanted to hide. The journal described a man who had lived near the logging road in 1991, a property owner named Richard Daniels, connected to local government and law enforcement. The entries ended abruptly in early 1998, leaving Patricia's investigation unresolved. Hannah sat in the attic, surrounded by dust and boxes, gripping her mother's journal. Anger and disbelief churned in her chest. Her mother had identified a potential suspect, and Hannah had never known. Why had Patricia stopped writing? What had she uncovered, or what had forced her to stop? The next day, Hannah drove to the Bethlehem Police Department, requesting to speak about Emily's case. She was directed to Detective Marcus Walsh, a veteran officer in his early 50s who had served for 25 years. Walsh listened intently as Hannah recounted the journal, promising to review the original case files. 2 days later, he called with information that validated Patricia's instincts. Richard Daniels, the property owner her mother had suspected, had been investigated at the time, but cleared based on an alibi provided by 2 witnesses, both township officials with business ties to Daniels. Walsh noted a troubling detail. Soil samples from Daniels' property had shown irregularities, but the lab analysis had been inconclusive. Daniels had died in 2015, making criminal charges impossible. But Walsh suggested that modern technology might shed new light on the decades-old evidence. He asked Hannah for permission to search the property, now owned by someone else but largely undeveloped. She agreed without hesitation. Within a week, investigators, with the landowner's permission, brought in ground-penetrating radar. The scan, conducted over 3 days, revealed multiple anomalies consistent with disturbed Earth. On the 4th day, excavation began at one anomaly. On August 8, 2021, 30 years and 3 weeks after Emily had vanished, they found her remains, buried approximately 6 feet deep in the back corner of Daniel's property, less than 2 miles from the logging road where search dogs had lost her scent. Forensic analysis completed months later confirmed what Hannah had suspected from her mother's journal. Emily had been killed within hours of her disappearance, transported to Daniel's property, and buried in a location that had never been searched because his alibi had shielded him. Further investigation revealed a pattern of corruption. Township officials who provided his alibi had financial ties to Daniel's. Soil irregularities had been dismissed without proper follow-up. And Patricia's concerns in 1997 had been actively discouraged by officers with political connections to him. Hannah attended Emily's funeral in September 2021, laying her sister to rest 30 years after she had disappeared. The ceremony was small, attended by a few of Emily's high school friends who still lived in the area and had never forgotten her. Hannah spoke of Emily's love of reading and hiking, of the sister who had watched over her during childhood, and of the 30. In November, the house in Bethlehem was sold. Hannah used part of the proceeds to establish a foundation supporting families of missing persons, specifically funding private investigations when official channels had failed. She named it the Emily and Patricia Brennan Foundation, honoring both her sister and their mother, who had never stopped searching for answers. Hannah returned to Philadelphia and her work with homeless youth, carrying a deeper understanding of how institutions could fail people and how persistence in seeking the truth could eventually break through walls of silence and corruption. She often thought of her mother, who had come so close to discovering the truth but had died without knowing that Emily would ultimately be found and brought home. Sometimes Hannah drove back to Bethlehem to visit the cemetery where Emily and their parents were now buried together. She would stand by the graves, telling them about the foundation, the families it was helping, and the cold cases being reopened with renewed attention. She liked to imagine that somewhere, Patricia knew her investigation had not been in vain, that the journal she had kept had finally fulfilled its purpose, and that Emily's story had ended not in unanswered questions, but with truth and justice. Delayed, but not forever denied.